So what exactly is the difference between running motivation and discipline? And more importantly, which one is going to help you get out the door on those training runs? Cheers, y'all. How's it going? Today we're going to be talking about some of the key differences between motivation and discipline as it pertains to your race training. I do just want to give a quick disclaimer that I am by no means an academic. This isn't based on any type of exhaustive research that I've conducted. This is purely based off of my own personal experience. But that being said, after several years of running different distances, different training styles, structures, road running, trail running, morning running, evening running, etc., that I've collected a significant amount of experience to rely on and talk a little bit about what has worked for me and what hasn't over those past several years. And although this is based on my personal experience, I do hope that some of it may be relatable to your training and can hopefully help you out down the line. If that's the case, I do hope you'll give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you don't already. But all of that being said, let's just dive into some quick definitions to go through what exactly is the difference between motivation and discipline. I feel like both of those terms are sort of buzzwords in the running community, in the workout space in general, thrown around quite a bit, but not necessarily with a lot of understanding or definitions thrown in. So in terms of how I kind of break down those two terms, let's start out with the motivation side of the house. And we'll picture this on sort of an axis where if we have one axis of short-term versus long-term and one of internal versus external, I would put motivation in sort of the short-term external variables that can influence your training. So at one end of the spectrum. And what I mean by that, let's start with the external piece. A lot of times I feel like you don't have any control over what's motivating. You don't have any control of whether or not you're going to be motivated to get outside for a run. But you may have some sources that you typically look to for motivation, things that have helped you feel motivated in the past, things like signing up for races, seeing somebody else's accomplishments on social media, etc. These external sources that you then absorb and can turn into motivation to help convince you to get out on that run or continue to work towards whatever training goal you have for yourself. But because you're looking towards these external sources to find motivation, it is somewhat unpredictable. You can't control necessarily whether or not you're going to find motivation on any given day. There are some caveats to that or some gray area, some workarounds where you can sort of cheat the system. One that immediately comes to mind is actually sort of how I started I Run on Beer, and that was finding some sort of reward structure for myself to reward myself after completing various parts of training. It's still an external source of motivation, but I'm sort of controlling when I'm getting it, if that makes sense. But I'll touch more on that later, but I just wanted to kind of make that clear, make that distinction clear, at least how I see it, that motivation is really coming from external sources. And again, I consider it short term because often you feel this boost of motivation. Let's look at New Year's resolutions as a perfect example. You set this new goal for yourself or race registration. You just signed up for this big goal race. And immediately afterwards, you feel this overwhelming sense of motivation to start training. You're putting in the work. It could last a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, etc. But I feel like oftentimes with motivation, that initial spike, that like endorphin rush that you get immediately from a sense of motivation starts to fade. And that's when you need something more long-term to keep you going, to keep you pushing through, especially as that training gets significantly more difficult. The struggle becomes much more significant as you get further along in those training blocks. And that is exactly where I think discipline comes into play. Realistically, in the grand scheme of things, I find there are very few days that I am motivated, but it's the discipline that convinces me to get out there and get it done. And again, if we're looking at it on that spectrum of internal versus external, long-term versus short-term, it is at the opposite end. Discipline is that internal influence and is much more long-term because you are in control. You can kind of curate that discipline, strengthen that discipline in yourself. I will certainly acknowledge that that is a lot easier said than done because basically discipline is just the ability to do something simply because you said you were going to do it. The discipline to just just keep your head down and grind through whatever the workout of the day is. Just like any muscle, I consider discipline similar to a muscle because it's kind of like this mental skill that you can develop. The more you do it, the more you stick to your routine and develop that discipline, the easier it gets over time. And again, this is something internal that you have control over. So the more you strengthen it, the easier time you're going to have sticking to the training plan as the days go on. Again, I fully recognize that this is much easier said than done, and I am personally in the middle of that battle right now. I've taken several weeks, a couple months off of running, or kind of on again, off again with running, because it started with an injury, fell out of my routine, various illnesses, a little bit of laziness, and I kind of let that routine fall by the wayside. And now I find myself struggling to find the discipline to push myself to get out the door because I lost a little bit of that muscle memory, lost a little bit of that routine, and I am now working once again to develop it and strengthen it as I start setting my sights on goals for myself in the future. There's another very popular running YouTuber. His name is Elijah Orr. Chances are you may be following him already. He has quite a substantial following, and I apologize because there's no way I'm gonna remember the specific video that this kind of quote or this lesson came from. But if you don't subscribe, highly encourage you to check out his channel. I wish I could tag the specific video, but it's from a few months ago. But he talked about how you stay disciplined in your run training. And one of the things that he recommended or talked about is how you have to treat running as one of your top priorities, if not your top priority. Fully recognizing that for most people, it is far from your top priority. But if you don't treat it like a top priority, it is much easier to find excuses to let some of those runs slip, whether you're feeling too tired, you want to spend time doing something else, etc. If you're not treating it as a priority, you will have a much easier time justifying reasons why not to do it. But what treating running like your top priority means is adjusting your schedule whenever and wherever possible to prioritize those training runs, eliminating as many potential excuses as possible to ensure there aren't any barriers to you getting out and grinding through that run. Can't emphasize scheduling your runs in the morning enough. I know this isn't necessarily possible for everyone, but if you can, getting your run done out of the way first thing in the morning eliminates the chance of other unexpected circumstances for interfering with the run later on. It has definitely been one of the biggest shifts that I have made in my training. But what that means, again, treating running like my top priority, is that I'm going to bed significantly earlier than most, if not everyone that I know. Usually getting into bed between like 8 and 8:30 to try to be asleep around 9 o'clock so that I can be up between 4:30 and 5 and out the door to get on that run before I have to commute into the city for work. Again, it's not fun, but you have to treat running like a top priority to make sure that you get it done. Also, rescheduling weekend plans, or if you have late night or evening weekend plans before a long run, making sure that you are responsible, drinking a lot of water, maybe abstaining from those few extra beers to make sure that you are waking up well rested, well recovered, and well hydrated before getting out on that weekend long run. Again, this has probably been one of the biggest impacts for me recently. A lot of celebrating with friends, a lot of weddings, etc., which don't bode well for those early morning long runs on the weekends. And I think all of this, again, speaking from personal experience, just really emphasizes the importance of getting into that routine, running at the same time every day, having that morning or evening routine, whatever it may be, to take out any of those unexpected variables, make running somewhat mechanical or automatic. And not necessarily the run itself, but the act of getting out the door, right? That's often the hardest part of sticking to these training runs, is just getting yourself out of bed, getting yourself dressed, getting out the door for the run. So the more you can automate that process and make it routine, the easier it will be to stick to that discipline that you've been working to build. So that being said, now that we've taken a look at sort of my personal definitions of motivation versus discipline, which is better, right? That's the important question. And I think they both have importance. They both have uses in different situations. But if I have to choose between one or the other, I'm going with discipline every time, purely because, again, it's longer term benefit and it's more internally controlled. You have the control, you have the say in developing and strengthening that personal discipline. Whereas motivation, more fleeting, more external, less predictable. So if I have to pick one, I'm going with discipline every time. But I mentioned there are good uses for each, and I think a perfect example is in the early days when maybe you don't have that structured routine, you don't have that strong personal discipline developed, motivation can be a really key tool to get you out the door in the short term. Perfect example of this, I mentioned I've been having my own personal struggles redeveloping and recommitting to my running routine. Just the other day, I saw a recent birthday post my uncle posted about this incredible months-long journey of fitness and nutrition that he's been on, the races that he's training for, and just a really, really incredible journey, which I found insanely motivating. And I took a look at myself, feeling somewhat bad, just, oh my God, I've been so lazy recently. I've been putting off running. I've been choosing to snooze the alarm, etc. Look at all that he's accomplished. What can I say is getting in the way of me getting out the door and going on the run? And that has gotten me out the door the last several days because I wake up and if I even have the inkling of a thought to, hey, I could hit the snooze, the bed feels so warm and cozy, I'd love to just stay here, I think to that post and that gets me out the door. So again, although I prefer the discipline, motivation is certainly there to pick up the slack while you work to curate that discipline. And I mentioned we would eventually circle back to this sort of idea of a reward system. How can you somewhat control the motivation that you have in your life to stick to a running routine? And what I have found works really well for me is developing a very specific kind of long-term reward structure for a given training plan. So I used to use this all the time in the early days when I was first starting out running, especially when I was working towards a big goal race. I would outline my training plan, put together all the weeks, the different mileages, etc., and I would try to identify sort of the key milestones throughout training. Maybe it was peak week, the longest run that I was going to have, or a significant increase in mileage during a given week, what have you. And I would go out, I would buy a bunch of specialty beers for myself, I'd lock them away in the back of the fridge, and I'd pick, when I hit this run, this is going to be the longest run I've ever done, I get to enjoy this beer. When I hit peak week, if I successfully complete all of my runs for peak week, I get to enjoy this beer. One for after the race, one for after different facets of running, or maybe like a new experience or something like that. But the key thing is to identify a specific goal for yourself to tie each reward to. And again, even though motivation is external and somewhat unpredictable, that at least gave me something to look forward to if I committed to and stuck to my goals, aka building discipline along the way. The trick is whatever goals you set for yourself and how you assign those rewards, you have to stick to them. You can't tweak it, you can't mix it up just because you missed one of your goal runs, etc. You have to stick to whatever that reward structure was, and if you miss one of those goals, you have to get rid of that reward. If it was a beer, it meant giving it away to someone else. Whatever it is for you, the important thing is you have to stick to that goal reward structure so that the process works, because if you don't, then you're just going to enjoy those rewards without necessarily sticking to whatever the training schedule you set for yourself was. So that's my 2 cents on the whole motivation versus discipline debate. But as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Let me know, which do you prefer, motivation versus discipline? Which do you use in different facets of your training? Any opinions that you'd like to share, comment down below. If you enjoyed the video and found it helpful, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up. That really does help with the YouTube algorithm. And if you don't already, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. But thank you as always for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you around. Cheers.